It began as just another night. Along the coast of Normandy, the wind rolled in from the English Channel, carrying nothing but the smell of salt water and wet sand. Waves broke gently against beaches that, for months, had become more fortress than shoreline. Rows of steel obstacles stretched into the surf. Minefields disappeared into the darkness. Concrete bunkers sat motionless, their gun barrels pointed toward an empty horizon. Inside those bunkers, German soldiers settled into another uneventful shift. Some poured coffee that had long since gone cold. Others smoked cigarettes to stay awake. A few quietly complained about the miserable weather, convinced that no sane army would attempt an invasion during a storm like this. After all, they'd been waiting for years. Ever since Germany occupied France in 1940, everyone knew the Allies would eventually return. Every false alarm, every radar contact, every rumor had ended the same way, with nothing happening. Over time, the tension faded into routine. Waiting became its own kind of battle. On the evening of June 5, 1944, most of the men standing watch believed this night would be no different. Farther inland, some officers weren't even at their headquarters. Field Marshal Rommel had returned to Germany, convinced that the worsening weather had bought everyone a few more days. Other commanders had taken leave, attended military exercises, or simply gone to bed expecting another quiet night. The Atlantic Wall stood ready, or so they thought. Just after midnight, one sentry paused. There it was, a faint sound, so distant it could almost be mistaken for the wind. An aircraft engine. He looked toward the darkness over the channel. Then another engine joined it. Then another. Within minutes, the sky was humming. Within half an hour, it was roaring. The sound became impossible to ignore. Not dozens of aircraft, not even hundreds, but what seemed like an endless stream, stretching across the night in every direction. Some soldiers stared upward in disbelief. Others rushed to telephones. Radar operators reported formations so large they assumed their equipment had malfunctioned. Officers began receiving conflicting reports from every sector at once. Parachutes, gliders, explosions, roadblocks, sabotage. No one could yet tell whether this was the invasion or another elaborate deception. Then the horizon began to change. As darkness slowly gave way to dawn, the sea itself seemed to disappear. Not because of the weather, because it was covered in ships, warships, destroyers, cruisers, battleships, landing craft, as far as the eye could see. Many German defenders would later recall the same feeling. They had spent years preparing for an invasion, but nothing had prepared them for the sheer scale of what they were seeing. It looked less like a fleet, and more like an entire nation crossing the sea. Within hours, history would record it as the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. But from inside the bunkers overlooking those beaches, no one knew how the day would end. They only knew one thing: the waiting was over. This is the story of D-Day, not from the landing craft racing toward the shore, but from the concrete bunkers that watched them coming. By the beginning of 1944, there was one question that haunted almost every German commander in Western Europe. Not if the Allies would invade, but when. For years earlier, Germany had conquered France in just 6 weeks. The victory had been so swift that many believed the English Channel had become an uncrossable moat protecting Hitler's empire. But as the war dragged on, that illusion disappeared. Across the water, Britain had become something far more dangerous than a defeated enemy. It had become a staging ground. Every month, more American troops arrived. More tanks rolled off ships. More aircraft filled the skies over southern England. The German high command didn't need spies to know what was happening. They could see it from aerial reconnaissance photographs. They intercepted radio traffic. Intelligence reports painted the same picture over and over again. An invasion wasn't merely possible anymore. It was inevitable. The only mystery was where. Would they strike the narrow waters of the Pas-de-Calais, where Britain and France were closest together? Or would they gamble on the longer beaches of Normandy? Perhaps somewhere completely unexpected. No one knew. And that uncertainty became its own weapon. To prepare for the inevitable assault, Hitler ordered the construction of what propaganda proudly called the Atlantic Wall, a defensive system stretching thousands of miles from Norway to the Spanish border. On paper, it sounded impenetrable. Massive concrete bunkers overlooked the beaches. Artillery batteries were dug into cliffs. Machine gun nests covered every likely landing zone. Miles of barbed wire crisscrossed the coastline. Millions of mines were buried beneath the sand, hidden in fields, and anchored just offshore beneath the waves. Steel obstacles, known today as Czech hedgehogs, Belgian gates, and Rommel's asparagus, were planted across beaches and open fields to tear apart landing craft and gliders before they could unload their troops. To anyone seeing photographs of the Atlantic Wall, it looked less like a coastline and more like a fortress, but appearances could be deceiving. Despite the grand speeches from Berlin, many sections of the wall remained unfinished. Concrete was in short supply. Construction crews struggled to keep pace with Hitler's demands. Some defensive positions had modern weapons. Others relied on artillery pieces captured years earlier from defeated armies across Europe. Normandy, in particular, presented an impossible challenge. Its coastline stretched for miles. Cliffs gave way to wide beaches. Small fishing villages sat between rivers and marshes that offered both obstacles and opportunities. Defending every possible landing site would have required far more soldiers than Germany could spare. Because by 1944, Germany was fighting everywhere. On the Eastern Front, millions of soldiers were locked in a brutal struggle against the Soviet Union. In Italy, Allied forces were pushing north toward Rome. Strategic bombing campaigns were destroying German factories almost daily. Every experienced unit transferred to France was a unit unavailable somewhere else. So the men stationed in Normandy were a mixture of veterans and newcomers. Some had survived years of combat in Russia. Others had never heard a shot fired in anger. Older reservists stood beside teenage conscripts who had only recently finished training. Some units consisted of soldiers recovering from wounds. Others included men from occupied territories serving under German command. They wore the same uniforms, but their experience varied enormously. Their days, however, were remarkably similar. Wake before sunrise. Inspect defensive positions. Repair storm damage. Lay more mines. Check ammunition. Patrol the beaches. Wait, and wait, then wait some more. Life along the Normandy coast settled into a routine that was almost painfully predictable. The weather often dictated the pace of the day. Rain turned roads into thick mud. Strong Atlantic winds buried obstacles beneath drifting sand. Saltwater corroded weapons that required constant maintenance. The enemy rarely appeared. Instead, the soldiers fought boredom. Cards became valuable currency inside bunkers. Cigarettes disappeared almost as quickly as they arrived. Letters from home were read until the paper became soft at the folds. The same conversations repeated every evening. When do you think they'll come? Probably next month. They said that last month. Eventually, speculation became a habit. Then came the false alarms. A radar station might detect unidentified aircraft crossing the channel. Someone reported suspicious naval activity offshore. A fisherman claimed to have seen strange lights on the horizon. Sirens sounded. Troops rushed to defensive positions. Machine guns were loaded. Artillery crews stood by their guns. Hours passed. Nothing happened. The alarm was canceled. Everyone returned to their routines. This happened again, and again, and again. Over time, many soldiers became skeptical. Some began to believe the Allies would never come. Others assumed the invasion would happen somewhere else. That dangerous combination of constant readiness and endless disappointment slowly wore away at morale. Human beings simply aren't built to remain on high alert forever. Eventually, even extraordinary threats begin to feel ordinary. But not everyone shared that confidence. One man looked at the Atlantic Wall and saw something very different. Erwin Rommel had earned his reputation commanding armored forces across North Africa. He understood the overwhelming strength of Allied air power better than almost anyone else in the German military. Every inspection tour reinforced the same conclusion. The defenses weren't ready. Not even close. Rommel believed that if Allied soldiers managed to establish a foothold on the beaches, Germany's chances of stopping them would shrink by the hour. Allied aircraft would dominate the skies, making large-scale German counterattacks almost impossible during daylight. His solution was simple: destroy the invasion on the beaches, or lose France. Not everyone agreed. Germany's senior commander in the West, Gerd von Rundstedt, argued for a completely different strategy. Rather than station precious armored divisions near the coast, he wanted to keep them farther inland. If the Allies landed, German tanks could then launch a massive counterattack once the main invasion point became clear. Rommel thought that was wishful thinking. Rundstedt thought Rommel was overreacting. Neither could convince the other. Ultimately, only one man could settle the dispute: Adolf Hitler. Hitler, as he increasingly did during the war, chose a compromise that satisfied neither commander. Some armored divisions remained close to the coast. Others stayed inland. Several were placed under Hitler's direct control, meaning local commanders couldn't deploy them without his personal authorization. It was a decision that would have enormous consequences only a few months later. For now, though, none of it seemed urgent. The Channel was quiet. The weather was poor. The beaches were empty. German soldiers continued their routines as they had for months, believing tomorrow would probably look exactly like today. But somewhere across that narrow stretch of water, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers were preparing to board ships. The invasion everyone had been waiting for was no longer a question of strategy. It had become a question of time. And no one on the Normandy coast knew exactly how little time remained. By the spring of 1944, there was one man who spent more time staring at the beaches of France than almost anyone else in the German military. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel wasn't interested in maps spread across conference tables or optimistic reports sent back to Berlin. He wanted to see the coastline with his own eyes. So he traveled, day after day, week after week. His staff followed him from one sector to the next as his staff car bounced along narrow coastal roads overlooking the English Channel. At nearly every stop, Rommel climbed out, walked across windswept dunes, inspected bunkers, questioned sentries, and studied every stretch of sand as though trying to imagine what it would look like covered in enemy soldiers. The answers he found disturbed him. On paper, Germany possessed one of the largest defensive systems ever constructed. In reality, it wasn't nearly enough. Rommel had learned a painful lesson years earlier while commanding German forces in North Africa. The enemy no longer fought only with ships and tanks. They fought with the sky. American and British aircraft had become so dominant that large troop movements during daylight were almost suicidal. Columns of vehicles could be spotted from miles away. Bridges disappeared beneath precision bombing. Reinforcements often never reached the battlefield. If the Allies landed in France and survived the first few hours, Rommel believed Germany would lose its greatest advantage: mobility. Every passing hour would allow the Allies to unload more men, more tanks, more artillery, more fuel, more ammunition. Once that happened, pushing them back into the sea would become nearly impossible. Rommel later summarized his thinking in remarkably simple terms. The battle would be decided on the first day, maybe even the first few hours. That belief shaped everything he did afterward. He demanded more mines, millions of them. Every beach, every path leading inland, every likely landing area became another place where explosives could be buried beneath the sand or hidden beneath the grass. Then came the steel. Great metal obstacles appeared across the Normandy coastline like the skeletons of giant machines. Some resembled enormous crosses welded together from heavy beams. Others were massive gates designed to rip open the bottoms of landing craft. Wooden stakes were driven into the surf at sharp angles, many topped with mines that would explode the moment a boat struck them. At low tide, the beaches looked almost unrecognizable. They had become obstacle courses built not to stop soldiers, but to slow them down, because Rommel knew something many people overlooked: time. Every extra minute an Allied soldier spent trapped on an exposed beach was another minute German machine guns and artillery could fire. Even a delay of 5 minutes might determine whether thousands lived or died. The defenses didn't end at the shoreline. Behind the beaches, engineers flooded low-lying fields by opening locks and diverting rivers. Entire meadows disappeared beneath shallow water, transforming open countryside into muddy lakes. To a farmer, they looked like flooded pastures. To a parachutist landing in darkness, they could become death traps. Gliders would crash. Vehicles would bog down. Troops unfamiliar with the terrain could drown before ever reaching dry ground. Rommel also ordered thousands of tall wooden poles planted across open fields. German soldiers jokingly nicknamed them Rommel's asparagus. The nickname sounded harmless. The purpose wasn't. If Allied gliders attempted to land at night, those poles would tear through wings, rip apart fuselages, and turn controlled landings into catastrophic crashes. Everywhere Rommel looked, he imagined another way the Allies might attack. Then he tried to make it impossible. Concrete bunkers multiplied across the coastline. Some housed machine guns carefully positioned to fire across the beaches rather than directly toward the sea. Others concealed anti-tank guns behind thick walls of reinforced concrete. Observation posts sat high atop cliffs, connected by buried telephone cables that stretched back to artillery batteries hidden miles inland. When viewed from above, many of these positions almost disappeared into the landscape. Their camouflage was intentional. The less Allied pilots saw, the longer the bunkers would survive. Yet despite all this construction, despite the mines, despite the obstacles, despite the bunkers, Rommel remained uneasy, because he knew defensive walls were only part of the equation. The real question was what happened after the invasion began. On that issue, the German High Command was deeply divided. The most senior commander in Western Europe, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, saw the battlefield very differently. Rundstedt had decades of military experience. To him, stationing Germany's armored divisions directly along the coast was a dangerous gamble. Naval gunfire could destroy them. Allied aircraft could attack them. If the invasion landed somewhere unexpected, those tanks might be trapped defending the wrong beaches. Instead, Rundstedt wanted the panzer divisions positioned farther inland, hidden, protected, ready to launch a massive counterattack once Germany identified the enemy's true objective. It was a strategy built on flexibility. Rommel thought flexibility was a luxury Germany no longer possessed. He believed that every mile the Allies advanced inland reduced Germany's chances of stopping them. The tanks needed to be waiting behind the beaches, close enough to attack immediately, close enough to strike before Allied engineers established supply lines, close enough to force the invaders back into the sea before their overwhelming numbers could take effect. The disagreement became more than a difference of opinion. It became one of the most important strategic debates of the entire war. Both men believed they were trying to save France. Both were convinced the other was making a catastrophic mistake. And ultimately, neither would get exactly what they wanted. The final decision rested with Adolf Hitler. As he increasingly did during the later years of the war, Hitler chose a compromise. Some panzer divisions remained near the coast. Others stayed inland. Several of Germany's most powerful armored formations were placed under Hitler's personal authority, meaning they couldn't be deployed unless he approved it himself. On paper, it appeared to balance both strategies. In practice, it created confusion. No commander could be entirely certain who controlled which units, or how quickly those units could respond once the invasion began. It was a flaw buried deep within Germany's defensive plan, one that remained invisible during the quiet spring days of 1944. But history has a way of exposing invisible flaws. And in just a few weeks, on a stormy morning along the Normandy coast, that single decision would echo across every beach, every bunker, and every battlefield in France. There was one enemy neither side could control. Not tanks, not aircraft, not spies, the weather. For months, military planners on both sides had studied the English Channel with almost obsessive attention. It was one of the most unpredictable stretches of water in the world. Calm seas could become violent in a matter of hours. Thick fog could swallow entire fleets. Strong tides could expose beaches one moment and hide deadly obstacles beneath the next. An invasion across the channel demanded almost impossible conditions. The moon had to provide enough light for airborne troops flying during the night. The tides had to be low at dawn so engineers could locate and clear the German beach obstacles before landing craft struck them. The sea had to be calm enough for thousands of small boats carrying soldiers who, for many, had never experienced rough water before. And the skies needed to be clear enough for Allied aircraft to support the invasion. Those conditions didn't occur often. When they did, the window lasted only a matter of days. As June approached, everyone watched the forecasts. German weather stations stretched from Norway to the coast of France. Every few hours they collected readings on wind speed, air pressure, wave height, and cloud cover. The reports traveled through military headquarters until they reached the meteorologists responsible for predicting what would happen over the channel. Their conclusions seemed reassuring. A powerful Atlantic storm was moving east. Heavy clouds, strong winds, rough seas, conditions that no commander, they believed, would willingly choose for the largest amphibious invasion in history. To many German officers, the forecast seemed almost like a gift. If the weather held, the Allies would have no choice but to postpone. Perhaps for days, perhaps for weeks. The atmosphere inside many headquarters began to change. The sense of constant anticipation that had lingered throughout the spring slowly gave way to cautious confidence. Nothing was going to happen. Not yet. Even Field Marshal Erwin Rommel reached the same conclusion. Rommel had spent months inspecting the Normandy defenses, often pushing himself and his staff to exhaustion. He had argued for more mines, more obstacles, more troops, more urgency. Yet even he believed the storm had bought Germany a little more time. There was another reason he decided to leave France. His wife, Lucy, was about to celebrate her birthday. Rommel also intended to meet with Adolf Hitler to request additional armored divisions for Normandy. It was an opportunity he didn't want to miss. If he could persuade Hitler, perhaps there was still time to strengthen the defenses before the invasion eventually came. So on June 5th, he climbed into his staff car and began the long journey back to Germany. He expected to return in a few days. He would never again inspect the Normandy beaches before the invasion. Rommel wasn't the only senior officer who relaxed. Across northern France, several commanders accepted invitations to conferences or military exercises. Others took short periods of leave. Some visited family members. Others simply enjoyed the rare chance to sleep through the night without expecting an emergency telephone call. The storm seemed to have granted everyone permission to breathe. Even along the coastline itself, the mood shifted. The beaches remained heavily defended, but the frantic pace of preparation eased. Soldiers still patrolled the dunes and checked their weapons, yet the urgency that had defined the previous weeks softened. Inside concrete bunkers, conversations became less about invasion plans and more about ordinary life. Someone complained about the food. Someone else wondered how much longer they'd be stationed in Normandy. Card games appeared once again. Coffee boiled over small stoves. Cigarette smoke drifted through narrow firing slits overlooking an empty sea. For many soldiers, it felt strangely peaceful. Outside, rain swept across the channel. The wind rattled barbed wire stretched along the beaches. Waves crashed against steel obstacles standing silently in the surf. The Atlantic wall seemed to disappear beneath gray skies and driving rain. If anyone had looked across the water toward England that afternoon, they would have seen almost nothing. Visibility was poor. The sea looked hostile. The weather forecast appeared to be proving itself right. What the German commanders didn't know was that, on the opposite side of the channel, Allied meteorologists had reached a very different conclusion. Hidden within the storm was a brief break. Not perfect weather. Not even good weather. Just good enough. A narrow window that might last only a single day before the channel became dangerous once again. It was an enormous gamble. If they waited, the next opportunity might not come for weeks. If they sailed now, they would be crossing one of the roughest seas many of the soldiers had ever seen. General Dwight D. Eisenhower made his decision. The invasion would proceed. But on the French coast, no one knew. The storm continued to howl. The beaches remained quiet. German sentries stared out across an empty horizon, convinced the weather had postponed history itself. They believed they still had time. Only a few hours remained. At 10 o'clock on the evening of June 5, 1944, Normandy looked exactly as it had the night before. And the night before that. The villages along the French coast were almost completely dark. Strict blackout regulations had been in place for years. Windows were covered. Streetlights remained off. The only light came from an occasional lantern inside a farmhouse or the glowing tip of a cigarette outside a bunker. The channel was hidden beneath thick clouds. Wind whipped across the beaches, carrying grains of wet sand against rows of steel obstacles planted in the surf. Every few seconds, another wave crashed into them with a hollow metallic sound before retreating back into the darkness. Inside the German defensive positions, the routine continued. Telephone operators monitored quiet lines. Machine gun crews sat beside their weapons. Artillerymen played cards to pass the time. Some soldiers cleaned rifles they had already cleaned earlier that day. Others tried to sleep before the next shift. No one expected history to arrive before morning. The weather still seemed too poor, too dangerous, too unpredictable. The storm that had swept across the English Channel appeared to be doing exactly what German meteorologists had promised, keeping the Allies in England. For many of the young sentries standing watch that evening, the greatest challenge wasn't fear. It was staying awake. By midnight, the wind had begun to change. The rain eased. Clouds still covered much of the sky, but patches of moonlight occasionally broke through, casting pale reflections across the water. Most soldiers barely noticed. Inside headquarters across Normandy, officers continued reading reports that sounded reassuring. No unusual naval activity. No confirmed enemy movements. No emergency alerts. Everything appeared normal. Then, shortly after midnight, a radar station along the French coast detected something unusual. At first, it looked insignificant. A handful of aircraft approaching from the northwest. That wasn't uncommon. British bombers crossed the channel almost every night. The operators logged the contact and continued watching their screens. But the blips didn't disappear. Instead, more appeared. Then more. Within minutes, the radar display was becoming crowded. One operator leaned closer. Another checked the equipment. Someone suggested interference caused by the weather. After all, storms often produced strange echoes. Yet the contacts kept multiplying. The radar wasn't malfunctioning. Something enormous was approaching. Just after 1 o'clock in the morning, the first German soldiers heard them. Not explosions. Not gunfire. Engines. Low, steady, and growing louder. Men stepped outside their bunkers and looked into the darkness. First, they couldn't see anything. Only clouds. Only darkness. But the sound continued building. It spread across the entire coastline like distant thunder. One aircraft, then another, then 10. Then so many that individual engines blended into a single, endless roar. Veterans who had survived years of bombing immediately recognized the sound. This wasn't a reconnaissance mission. This wasn't a routine bombing raid. This was something far larger. Telephone lines suddenly became busy. Observation posts called nearby headquarters. Headquarters called division commanders. Reports flooded in almost faster than they could be written down. Large aircraft formations crossing the channel. Heading toward Normandy. Heading inland. No one knew exactly how many. Only that there were far too many to ignore. Then the first parachutes appeared. In the darkness, they were almost invisible. German sentries often spotted the aircraft before they noticed the men falling beneath them. Silhouettes drifted silently through breaks in the clouds. Some landed in open fields. Others descended into orchards. Many missed their intended drop zones entirely, scattered across miles of countryside by strong winds and heavy anti-aircraft fire. From the German perspective, it made almost no sense. Paratroopers were appearing everywhere. Some villages reported only a handful. Others reported hundreds. Roadblocks emerged where none had existed an hour earlier. Telephone wires were suddenly cut. Small bridges came under attack. Military police encountered armed men wearing unfamiliar uniforms deep behind German lines. The reports contradicted one another so completely that many officers struggled to understand what they were hearing. Was this the invasion, or was it another deception? Then came the gliders. Unlike transport aircraft, gliders made almost no noise. Many German soldiers never heard them coming. The first indication was the crash. With splintering, metal twisting, trees snapping apart. Entire aircraft seemed to appear from nowhere before smashing into fields and hedgerows. Within seconds, Allied airborne troops poured out into the darkness. Firefights erupted across the Norman countryside. Not massive battles, small ones. A crossroads, a farmhouse, a bridge, a churchyard. German patrols stumbled into American and British paratroopers who were just as surprised to find them. Some engagements lasted only a few minutes. Others continued until dawn. Confusion spread faster than accurate information. By nearly 2 o'clock, German headquarters were drowning in reports. Enemy parachutists near Saint-Mère-Église. Gliders west of the Orne River. Sabotage teams attacking communications. Bridges under assault. Roads blocked. Aircraft everywhere. The problem wasn't a lack of information. It was too much information. No one could determine which reports were accurate. Some commanders believed the airborne landings marked the beginning of the long-awaited invasion. Others remained skeptical. The Allies had spent years conducting deception operations. False radio traffic, dummy equipment, fake troop concentrations. Could these paratroopers simply be another diversion? A way to convince Germany that Normandy was the real target while the main invasion landed somewhere else? Even among senior commanders, opinions differed. Some ordered immediate action. Others hesitated, waiting for confirmation that never seemed to arrive. Those lost minutes would prove impossible to recover. Meanwhile, the sky above Normandy had transformed. More than 2,000 Allied aircraft crossed overhead during the night. Transport planes, bombers, fighters, glider tugs. Their engines merged into a continuous sound unlike anything most German defenders had ever experienced. It seemed as though the entire sky had come alive. For the young soldiers standing watch along the beaches, sleep was no longer a possibility. Many climbed onto bunker roofs or observation posts, staring upward in disbelief. Some later admitted they had never imagined so many aircraft could exist. Others quietly realized something they hadn't wanted to believe. If the Allies were willing to commit this many planes, then whatever came next would be unlike anything they had ever faced. Still, the beaches remained empty. The sea remained dark. No invasion fleet had yet appeared. Only aircraft, only paratroopers, only confusion. For a few more hours, the German commanders clung to one final hope. Perhaps this wasn't the main attack after all. Perhaps the real invasion was still waiting somewhere else. But out beyond the darkness of the English Channel, hidden beyond the horizon, more than 5,000 ships were already moving toward Normandy. And with every passing minute, they came closer. For the German soldiers scattered across Normandy, the invasion didn't begin on the beaches. It began in the fields. By the time the first reports of parachutists reached headquarters, they were already outdated. Allied airborne troops had landed across an area stretching for miles, and almost none of it had gone according to plan. Strong winds, anti-aircraft fire, and poor visibility had scattered American and British paratroopers far from their intended drop zones. Entire companies landed in the wrong villages. Some units found themselves miles away from their objectives. From the Allied perspective, it was a serious problem. From the German perspective, it was complete chaos. There was no obvious front line. Enemy soldiers seemed to be appearing everywhere. Just after 2 o'clock in the morning, a German patrol was making its routine rounds along a narrow country road bordered by hedgerows. There was nothing unusual about the patrol. For men, one non-commissioned officer, a quiet stretch of road they had walked dozens of times before. Then one of the soldiers heard movement in the darkness. Not an engine, not footsteps, branches shifting. The patrol stopped. Everyone listened. Silence. The officer raised a flashlight. For a brief moment, its beam swept across a figure standing only a few yards away. The man wasn't wearing a German uniform. Gunfire erupted instantly. Within seconds, both sides disappeared into the maze of hedgerows, firing blindly through leaves and branches. When the shooting finally stopped, no one was entirely certain who had escaped. Encounters like this unfolded across Normandy hundreds of times that night. Neither side knew exactly where the other was. Small groups collided by accident. Roads became battlefields. Farmhouses changed hands without anyone outside hearing a shot. Everywhere, uncertainty replaced certainty. German headquarters depended heavily on one thing: communication. Every observation post, artillery battery, and defensive strongpoint was connected through a network of buried telephone cables. Messages could move from a frontline bunker to division headquarters in minutes. Unless those lines were cut. That was one of the first objectives assigned to Allied airborne troops. Small demolition teams slipped through orchards and drainage ditches searching for communication lines. Sometimes they located them by following poles along country roads. Other times they simply listened. A faint electrical hum beneath the soil. A cable emerging from a concrete bunker. A line disappearing into a hedgerow. One quick cut with wire cutters, and another German position fell silent. Telephone operators lifted receivers only to hear static. They tried alternate lines. Nothing. Switchboards that had functioned perfectly an hour earlier suddenly became useless. Messages that should have taken minutes now required motorcycles, bicycles, or runners moving through territory where no one could guarantee what waited around the next corner. Every delay made the situation worse. Then came the bridges. Normandy's landscape was divided by rivers, canals, and flooded marshes. The number of crossing points was surprisingly small. German commanders understood their importance. So did the Allies. Before dawn, explosions echoed across the countryside. Some bridges were blown apart. Others became scenes of fierce firefights as airborne troops attempted to seize them intact before German reinforcements could arrive. To commanders studying maps inside headquarters, those bridges looked like simple lines crossing blue rivers. To the soldiers fighting over them, they became the difference between reinforcement and isolation. Entire units suddenly discovered they could no longer reach neighboring positions. Roads that had always been open were now blocked. Not by destroyed vehicles, by enemy soldiers. The confusion spread in ways no one had anticipated. As Allied paratroopers moved through villages, they began removing road signs. Some were torn down. Others were turned around. A few were carried away completely. It sounded almost trivial, until German drivers began receiving orders. One dispatch rider reached a crossroads and stopped. The sign pointing toward his destination was gone. Another truck convoy followed directions that now led to the wrong village. Staff cars carrying officers drove in circles through unfamiliar countryside. Some units lost hours simply trying to determine where they were. Later, German reports would describe roads crowded with vehicles heading in every direction, many searching for battles that had already moved somewhere else. Inside headquarters, the flow of information became almost impossible to manage. Telephone would ring. Enemy paratroopers reported near Saint-Mere-Église. Another call. British airborne troops attacking bridges east of the Orne. Another. Roadblock near Corentin. Another. Gliders landing west of Cannes. Another. Enemy uniforms seen outside a village where no Allied forces were believed to exist. The reports arrived so quickly and contradicted each other so completely that officers struggled to separate rumor from reality. Some messages were accurate. Others were exaggerated. A few were simply wrong. One frightened sentry might report 50 enemy soldiers. The actual number could be 5. Another report underestimated an entire airborne battalion as only a small patrol. Every decision became a gamble. Send reinforcements, or hold them back. Commit reserves, or wait for confirmation. No one wanted to move too early. No one wanted to move too late. Some commanders became convinced that Normandy was only a distraction. The Germans had expected deception. In fact, they had been expecting it for months. The Allies had repeatedly suggested that the real invasion would land farther north, across the narrow waters near Pas-de-Calais. Could these airborne attacks simply be reinforcing that illusion? A few divisions hesitated. Others remained convinced the main blow hadn't yet fallen. The uncertainty spread upward through the chain of command. Every headquarters was trying to build a complete picture. But every headquarters possessed only fragments. As dawn approached, German officers unfolded maps across tables already crowded with reports. Colored pins marked sightings of enemy troops. Within an hour, the maps were covered. Paratroopers appeared to be everywhere. North, south, east, west. The pattern made no sense. It looked less like a carefully planned military operation, and more like chaos itself. Ironically, that chaos worked in the Allies' favor, because scattered, airborne units created the illusion of a force much larger than actually existed. German commanders couldn't identify the main objectives. They couldn't determine where the heaviest fighting was occurring. They couldn't tell whether they were facing isolated raiding parties, or the opening moves of a full-scale invasion. For the soldiers on the ground, the experience was even more unsettling. They had spent years preparing to defend fixed positions, concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, beach obstacles. Instead, they found themselves searching dark fields and narrow hedgerows for an enemy that appeared without warning, fired a few shots, and vanished back into the night. Every shadow became suspicious. Every distant sound demanded investigation. By sunrise, many German units had been fighting for hours. Yet remarkably few understood what was actually happening. They knew Allied soldiers were behind their lines. They knew communications were collapsing. They knew key roads and bridges were under attack. But they still didn't know the most important fact of all. The airborne landings were only the beginning. Out beyond the gray waters of the English Channel, an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen was approaching the Normandy coast. And within the next few hours, the battle would become impossible to mistake. By 4:30 in the morning, the fighting inland had been raging for hours. German headquarters were still trying to make sense of the reports pouring in from every direction. Telephone lines had gone silent. Dispatch riders disappeared somewhere along dark country roads. Airborne troops had cut roads, seized bridges, and attacked isolated strongpoints. Yet along much of the coastline, there was still nothing to see. The beaches remained empty. The sea remained hidden beneath darkness and patches of drifting fog. For the soldiers manning Normandy's coastal defenses, the invasion still felt strangely distant. They had heard the aircraft. They knew something extraordinary was happening inland. But the shoreline itself remained quiet, almost unnaturally quiet. The only sounds were the wind, the surf, and the occasional burst of gunfire echoing from villages farther inland. Some men convinced themselves the airborne attacks were the main operation. Others believed they were witnessing another elaborate Allied deception. The real invasion, they thought, would come somewhere else. Perhaps at Pas-de-Calais, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next week. No one imagined that history was already moving toward them through the morning mist. As the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, visibility slowly improved. The heavy clouds began to break apart. Fog drifted low across the surface of the channel, revealing and concealing the horizon with every passing minute. German observers climbed into lookout positions built atop cliffs and inside reinforced concrete bunkers. Binoculars swept across the water. At first, nothing. Just gray sea meeting gray sky. Then one observer froze. Far offshore, there was something. A dark shape. Too large to be a fishing boat. Too slow to be a patrol craft. He adjusted the focus. Another shape appeared beside it. Then another. Within moments, there were too many to count. Messages began moving along the coastline. Ships sighted offshore. Large numbers. Possibly enemy. Observation posts confirmed the reports one after another. The fog continued lifting. And with every minute, more ships appeared. Not 10. Not 20. Not 50. Hundreds. Some sat low in the water like enormous steel islands. Others moved in long, carefully organized columns stretching beyond the limits of human vision. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, landing ships, transport vessels, tank carriers, escort craft. The sea itself seemed to be changing shape. One German observer later recalled that the horizon had simply disappeared. Where there should have been open water, there was steel. Everywhere. Many German veterans who survived the war described the same moment in almost identical terms. They had expected an invasion. They had trained for it. They had discussed it for years. But nothing had prepared them for the sheer size of the fleet. Maps and intelligence estimates suddenly felt meaningless. Standing inside a bunker overlooking the English Channel, it looked as though an entire civilization was crossing the sea. Some soldiers watched in complete silence. Others immediately understood what they were seeing. This wasn't a raid. This wasn't a diversion. This was everything. Inside German command posts, telephones rang almost continuously. Enemy fleet sighted. Requesting confirmation. Enemy fleet confirmed. Strength impossible to estimate. Additional reports followed from neighboring sectors. Every coastal observer was describing the same unbelievable sight. The invasion fleet extended across nearly the entire horizon. At first, some headquarters questioned the reports. Surely the numbers were exaggerated. Fear often distorted perception. Perhaps nervous observers had mistaken small vessels for large ones. Perhaps several formations had been counted twice. Then aerial reconnaissance confirmed the impossible. The reports hadn't exaggerated. If anything, they had underestimated. More than 5,000 Allied vessels were now approaching Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion force ever assembled. And it was heading directly toward the beaches the Germans had spent years fortifying. For a brief moment, everything became strangely still. The ships continued advancing. The defenders waited. Neither side fired. The distance between them steadily disappeared. Some German soldiers loaded belts into machine guns with shaking hands. Artillery crews checked firing tables one final time. Officers climbed onto observation platforms, scanning the fleet through binoculars. Everyone knew what came next. No one knew when. Then, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, the first flashes appeared aboard the battleships. They looked almost harmless from that distance. Tiny bursts of orange against the gray morning sky. A second later, the sound arrived. A deep rolling thunder unlike anything most soldiers had ever heard. Then another flash. Another explosion. Another. Within seconds, the entire horizon erupted. The Allied fleet had opened fire. The shells took nearly a minute to reach shore. That brief delay created an eerie silence after each salvo. German defenders watched the flashes. They heard the guns. And then they waited. The first shells struck the cliffs overlooking the beaches with tremendous force. Concrete shattered. Earth erupted into the air. Entire sections of hillside simply vanished beneath towering columns of smoke and dust. Another salvo landed farther inland. Then another. Then another. Soon there was no pattern anyone could follow. Explosions surrounded the defensive positions from every direction. Heavy naval guns, some firing shells weighing nearly a ton, hammered the coastline with relentless precision. Inside the bunkers, the experience was overwhelming. Concrete walls that had been designed to survive bombardment suddenly trembled beneath the impact. Dust poured from ceilings. Electric lights swung wildly. Telephone receivers crashed onto the floor. Men instinctively covered their heads as the structures shook around them. Some believed direct hits had already destroyed neighboring bunkers. Others couldn't hear shouted orders over the continuous roar outside. The bombardment became so intense that distinguishing individual explosions was impossible. It merged into one endless sound. One German artillery officer later described it as feeling less like isolated shellfire, and more like an earthquake that refused to end. Observation became nearly impossible. Smoke drifted across the beaches. Dust clouds swallowed entire defensive positions. Telephone lines that had somehow survived the airborne attacks were now severed by shellfire. Commanders struggled to determine which guns remained operational. Some batteries continued firing. Others had already fallen silent. No one knew why. Had they been destroyed? Had communications failed? Were the crews dead? The answers wouldn't come until much later. Then, through the smoke, movement, small shapes began separating from the larger ships offshore. At first, they looked insignificant. Tiny dark specks crossing an impossibly wide stretch of water. But there were hundreds of them, then thousands. Landing craft, each one carrying soldiers toward the beaches. The naval bombardment had only been the beginning. Now, the men inside the bunkers could finally see the enemy they had spent years preparing to fight. And within minutes, the beaches of Normandy would become the center of the largest amphibious assault in human history. By the time the first landing craft were nearing Omaha Beach, much of the German command structure in Normandy was already under strain. For hours, reports of airborne landings had poured into headquarters. Telephone lines had been severed. Couriers were struggling to move between positions. Commanders knew something enormous was happening, but they still lacked a clear picture of where the main blow would fall. Then the naval bombardment began. Within minutes, the uncertainty disappeared. The coastline itself had become the battlefield. Omaha Beach occupied a unique stretch of the Norman coast. Unlike the broad, flat beaches found elsewhere, Omaha was backed by steep bluffs rising more than 100 feet above the shoreline in places. Narrow draws, natural gaps carved through the cliffs by streams over thousands of years, provided some of the only practical routes inland. German engineers immediately recognized their importance. If an invading army wanted to leave the beach quickly, those draws were where it would have to go. So the defenses were built around them. Rather than forming one continuous wall, the German positions were organized into a network of fortified strongpoints known as Widerstandsnester, literally, resistance nests. Each strongpoint was designed to support the others. A machine gun bunker might protect an artillery position farther down the beach. An observation post on a cliff could direct mortar fire onto the sand below. Anti-tank guns covered the exits leading inland. Trenches connected firing positions. Underground shelters protected ammunition. On maps, they appeared as small symbols scattered across the coastline. In reality, they formed overlapping fields of fire that made large portions of the beach extremely dangerous. Yet even these strong points were not identical. Some had thick reinforced concrete walls. Others consisted of earthworks and timber. Some were manned by experienced veterans. Others by soldiers who had never before faced an amphibious assault. The Atlantic Wall was formidable, but it was far from uniform. Inside one observation bunker overlooking Omaha, dawn was almost impossible to recognize. Smoke from the naval bombardment drifted across the coastline in heavy gray sheets. Dust filled the air after every impact. The narrow viewing slits that gave defenders a clear view of the sea only minutes earlier were now clouded by debris. Each explosion shook the structure. Concrete dust rained from the ceiling. Maps slid across tables. Telephone receivers swung against bunker walls. The bombardment had lasted only a short time. Yet to many defenders it felt much longer. Several German veterans later recalled losing all sense of time during those opening minutes. There were only flashes, impacts, and waiting for the next shell. As the bombardment began to lift, observers cautiously looked back toward the water. The invasion fleet was still there. Only now something had changed. Hundreds of smaller craft were separating from the larger ships. Landing craft, wave after wave. They advanced steadily toward the shore. Some German positions immediately opened fire. Others waited until the boats drew closer. The exact timing differed from one strongpoint to another depending on visibility, damage from the bombardment, and local command decisions. The carefully prepared defensive system was no longer theoretical. It was finally being used. The first minutes after the landings were confusing for everyone. Smoke obscured large sections of the beach. Naval gunfire continued striking targets farther inland. The tide carried obstacles, wreckage, and damaged equipment in every direction. From many German positions, only fragments of the battlefield were visible. A bunker overlooking one section of the beach often had little idea what was happening only a few hundred yards away. Communication, already weakened by the airborne attacks, deteriorated even further. Telephone lines that had survived the night were cut by shellfire. Radio traffic became increasingly difficult amid the constant noise and damaged equipment. Some positions could no longer contact neighboring strongpoints. Others received reports that were already outdated by the time they arrived. As a result, many commanders were forced to rely almost entirely on what they could see with their own eyes. And what they saw depended entirely on where they stood. In several sectors overlooking Omaha, the initial Allied assault encountered severe resistance. Landing craft arrived under difficult conditions. Some were pushed off course by currents. Others unloaded troops farther from their intended objectives. The beach quickly became crowded with obstacles, damaged vehicles, and groups of soldiers seeking cover wherever they could find it. From certain German observation posts, it appeared that the defenses were holding. The beach exits remained under fire. Some strong points continued reporting successful resistance. Several after-action reports from that morning reflected cautious optimism. The invasion, at least in their sector, seemed to be struggling. For men who had spent years preparing for this exact moment, it was easy to believe their defenses had worked. But Omaha Beach was too large, and the battle too complex, for anyone to understand from a single bunker. Beyond the smoke, more landing craft were approaching. Behind those, still more. The invasion did not consist of one wave. Consisted of many. As damaged boats turned away, others continued moving forward. As some units became pinned down, others landed in different locations. The scale of the operation meant that losses alone could not halt the assault. Every few minutes, new craft emerged from the haze. To defenders watching from the bluffs, it sometimes seemed impossible. No matter how many boats had already reached the shore, more appeared behind them. Throughout the morning, the situation at individual Widerstandsness positions began to diverge. Some continued fighting for hours. Others found themselves increasingly isolated. Without reliable communications, neighboring strongpoints often had no idea whether support was coming. Some artillery batteries could no longer receive updated target information. Observation posts lost contact with headquarters. Orders that might once have taken minutes to relay now depended on runners attempting to cross terrain under constant bombardment. Many never arrived. The carefully connected defensive network gradually became a collection of isolated positions, each responding to events as best it could. The battlefield itself became increasingly difficult to interpret. Smoke from burning equipment drifted inland. Dust from shell impacts settled over trenches and gun emplacements. Visibility changed from minute to minute as the wind shifted. Some defenders later recalled that they could hear far more than they could see. Naval guns firing offshore. Machine gun bursts echoing across the bluffs. Artillery, engines, shouted commands in different languages. The entire coastline seemed to merge into one continuous roar. Even experienced soldiers struggled to understand where the fighting was heaviest. As the morning wore on, reports reaching higher headquarters became increasingly contradictory. One sector reported that the defenses remained intact. Another requested immediate reinforcements. One officer believed the landings had been contained. Another warned that Allied troops were beginning to move inland through gaps in the defenses. Neither report was entirely wrong. They simply described different parts of an enormous battlefield. The reality at Omaha Beach could not be captured in a single message. By late morning, it became clear that the invasion had not ended with the first wave, nor the second. The Allied fleet offshore still stretched across the horizon. Landing craft continued their steady journey toward the beach. Every arrival brought more men, more equipment, and more opportunities to exploit weaknesses that inevitably emerged in even the strongest defensive system. For many German defenders, this marked the moment their understanding of the battle changed. The question was no longer whether the landings could be stopped at the water's edge. The question had become whether isolated strongpoints, cut off from one another and facing an opponent of immense scale, could continue to hold indefinitely? The answer would unfold over the remaining hours of D-Day. And by then, the battle for Omaha Beach had become only one part of a much larger struggle taking place across the entire Normandy coast. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, one thing had become painfully clear to German commanders in Normandy. There wasn't one battle. There were many. From the eastern flank near the Orne River to the western approaches around the Cotentin Peninsula, the fighting had developed differently in almost every sector. Reports arriving at headquarters described battles that often seemed impossible to reconcile with one another. One commander reported that enemy troops were pinned to the shoreline. Another warned that Allied soldiers were already moving inland. Some defensive positions remained intact. Others had fallen silent. The invasion was unfolding along nearly 50 miles of coastline, and no single headquarters could see the entire picture. Utah Beach. At the western end of the invasion area, the situation around Utah Beach developed in an unexpected way. Strong currents and heavy seas pushed many of the first Allied landing craft away from their planned landing zones. Instead of arriving exactly where planners had intended, troops came ashore farther south. For the soldiers stepping onto the beach, it initially appeared to be a navigational mistake. Ironically, that mistake reduced the immediate resistance they encountered. Several heavily defended positions overlooked areas that the first assault waves largely bypassed. German defenders still fought, and artillery continued to fire from positions farther inland. But the initial landings did not unfold exactly as either side had expected. The greater challenge for German commanders lay beyond the shoreline. American airborne troops had landed during the night across much of the Cotentin Peninsula. Though scattered by weather and anti-aircraft fire, they had disrupted roads, bridges, and communications. As daylight spread across the countryside, local commanders found themselves responding to threats in multiple directions at once. The beaches demanded attention. So did the villages inland. For officers trying to organize an effective response, separating rumor from reality became increasingly difficult. Gold Beach. Farther east. Around Gold Beach, German defenses faced a different set of problems. The morning bombardment had damaged several coastal positions, although the effects varied considerably from one strong point to another. Some bunkers continued firing. Others had lost communications. Some artillery crews remained at their guns despite the shelling, while neighboring positions struggled simply to determine what was happening. As Allied troops advanced from the shoreline, fighting became increasingly localized. Instead of one continuous defensive line, the battle centered on individual villages, crossroads, and fortified positions. German reports from this sector reflected growing uncertainty. Some units described determined resistance. Others requested reinforcements that could not immediately be spared. Without reliable communication, commanders often relied on dispatch riders or fragmented radio transmissions to piece together events. By the time many reports reached higher headquarters, the tactical situation had already changed. Juno Beach. Near Juno Beach, the experience differed again. The Canadian assault encountered determined resistance during the opening stages of the landings, particularly around fortified coastal positions and built-up areas overlooking the shoreline. As elsewhere, naval bombardment had disrupted portions of the German defensive network, but not uniformly. Some strong points remained operational long enough to slow the advance significantly. Others were isolated almost immediately. Throughout the morning, German commanders attempted to identify where the heaviest Allied effort was developing. The answer proved elusive. The invasion stretched across such a wide front that each local commander saw only a small piece of the battle. One sector might appear relatively stable. Another, only a few miles away, faced entirely different circumstances. This uneven picture complicated every decision regarding reserves and reinforcements. Sword Beach. On the eastern flank around Sword Beach, yet another battle was unfolding. British forces landed closer to the city of Caen than anywhere else along the invasion front. For German commanders, that proximity carried enormous strategic importance. Caen was more than a city. It was a transportation hub. Roads radiated outward in several directions, making it essential for moving troops and supplies throughout Normandy. Losing control of the surrounding area could disrupt German operations well beyond the coastline. Complicating matters further, British airborne troops had seized several key objectives east of the Orne River during the night, limiting German freedom of movement even before the beach landings began. As reports from Sword Beach reached headquarters, they blended with earlier messages concerning bridges, airborne forces, and scattered engagements across the countryside. The result was an increasingly confusing operational picture, puzzle no one could solve. By late morning, headquarters throughout Normandy were overwhelmed with information. Each message added another piece to the puzzle. Enemy landings confirmed. Bridges under attack. Strong points still holding. Communications lost. Requests for artillery. Requests for reinforcements. Sightings of additional landing craft. Yet the most important question remained unanswered. Where was the main attack? German planners had long expected that any invasion of Western Europe might include deception. For months, intelligence assessments had emphasized the possibility of a landing near the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest crossing between Britain and France. Even after troops began landing in Normandy, some senior commanders remained reluctant to commit every available reserve. What if Normandy was only the opening move? What if an even larger invasion followed elsewhere? The uncertainty affected decisions at every level. Some formations moved cautiously. Others waited for orders. Still others struggled simply to establish contact with neighboring units. A battlefield measured in fragments. The greatest challenge facing German commanders on June 6 was not a lack of courage or effort among the troops defending the coast. It was information. No one possessed a complete view of events. A bunker overlooking one beach could not see another. A divisional headquarters often relied on reports that were already hours old. Telephone lines had been cut. Roads were disrupted. Smoke, dust, and the scale of the invasion obscured much of the battlefield. Every commander operated with only fragments of the larger picture, and those fragments rarely fit neatly together. By midday, it was evident that the Allied landings had established footholds at multiple points along the Normandy coast. What remained uncertain was whether those footholds could be contained, or whether they represented the beginning of a campaign that would fundamentally change the course of the war in Western Europe. That question would shape every German decision during the days that followed. By the morning of June 6, 1944, German commanders along the Normandy coast no longer doubted that an invasion was underway. The question had changed. It was no longer, "Are the Allies coming?" It had become, "How do we stop them?" For many officers, the answer seemed obvious. Commit the panzer divisions. Germany still possessed powerful armored formations stationed in France. If they could move quickly enough, they might counterattack before the Allies fully established themselves ashore. But there was a problem created months before the invasion ever began. The German command system had become increasingly centralized under Adolf Hitler. Throughout the war, Hitler had assumed more and more direct control over military decisions. By 1944, several key armored divisions in France were held in reserve under his personal authority. Local commanders could not simply order them into battle. Permission had to come from Hitler himself. On paper, the arrangement seemed logical. The German leadership still feared that Normandy might be a diversion. Intelligence assessments continued to suggest that the main Allied invasion could fall farther north, in the Pas-de-Calais region. If every reserve was committed too early, there might be nothing left to stop a second, even larger landing. But military plans drawn up in quiet conference rooms often looked very different once the shooting started. As dawn broke over Normandy, reports continued arriving from every direction. Airborne troops had landed during the night. The beaches were under assault. Naval bombardment was ongoing. Communications were breaking down. Yet despite the growing urgency, uncertainty remained at the highest levels of command. Was Normandy truly the main invasion? Or was it exactly the deception German planners had expected? No one could answer with complete confidence. Adding to the confusion was the simple fact that Hitler was asleep. According to accounts from those present at headquarters, Members of his staff were reluctant to wake him without overwhelming confirmation that the situation required it. This hesitation has become one of the most discussed moments of D-Day. Modern historians note that the delay was only one factor among many that affected Germany's response. Allied air superiority, damaged communications, the scale of the invasion, and earlier command decisions all played major roles. Still, at the time, officers in Normandy were waiting for decisions that only one man could authorize. And every passing hour mattered. Far from the fighting, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was also absent. Convinced that poor weather had made an invasion unlikely, Rommel had returned to Germany the previous day. He intended to spend time with his family and then meet Hitler to argue once again for stronger defenses and additional armored forces in France. Instead, he received news that changed everything. The invasion had begun. Rommel immediately started making his way back toward Normandy. But distance has a way of turning minutes into hours. While he traveled, events at the front continued unfolding without him. Inside headquarters across western France, the atmosphere grew increasingly tense. Operations maps were updated almost continuously. Colored markers spread farther inland. Fresh reports arrived before earlier ones could be fully assessed. Some coastal positions still reported determined resistance. Others had gone silent. Staff officers tried to assemble a coherent picture from scattered fragments of information. It was like trying to complete a puzzle while someone kept changing the pieces. As the morning wore on, commanders repeated the same requests. They needed armored support. They needed reinforcements. They needed clear authority to respond. Some units were already moving under existing orders. Others remained in place, awaiting confirmation. The result was not complete paralysis, but a response slowed by uncertainty, competing chains of command, and the difficulty of determining exactly where Germany's strongest reserves would have the greatest effect. When authorization for additional panzer movements finally came, the battlefield had already changed. Allied troops had strengthened several beachheads. More soldiers, vehicles, and supplies continued coming ashore. The invasion force was growing larger with every hour. For German commanders, time had become the one resource they could not replace. In the years after the war, the image of Hitler sleeping while the invasion unfolded became one of the defining stories of D-Day. It is a compelling image, but historians caution against treating it as the single explanation for Germany's difficulties that morning. The German response was shaped by a combination of factors. The success of Allied deception efforts, disrupted. Communications, disagreements over strategy before the invasion, overwhelming Allied naval and air power, and the immense scale of the landings themselves. Even so, for officers waiting anxiously in Normandy on June 6, those distinctions offered little comfort. They faced an invasion unlike any in history. They needed decisions. They needed reinforcements. And with every hour that passed, the opportunity to contain the landings became more difficult to recover. By the afternoon of June 6, the battle was no longer confined to the beaches. The dramatic images that would come to define D-Day, the landing craft, the naval bombardment, the towering cliffs, captured only the opening hours of an operation that was already spreading far inland. Beyond the shoreline, Normandy looked very different. The landscape was divided into thousands of small fields, each surrounded by ancient earthen embankments topped with thick hedges. Some stood taller than a man. Others had grown undisturbed for centuries, their roots binding together walls of earth, brush, and tangled trees. Known as the bocage, this countryside was beautiful. It was also extraordinarily difficult to fight in. Visibility was limited. Roads twisted between villages. Every field became its own enclosed world. A soldier could stand only a few yards away from another position and never know it was there. The carefully planned movements envisioned before the invasion quickly gave way to a series of small, localized engagements. Throughout Normandy, villages that had been quiet farming communities only hours earlier suddenly became crossroads of military activity. Stone houses overlooked narrow streets. Church steeples rose above clusters of rooftops, visible from miles away. Road junctions that once carried carts and bicycles now became strategically important. Control of a single village could determine access to several surrounding roads. As a result, fighting often centered on places that, before June 6th, had held little military significance. For local civilians, the transformation was immediate. Communities that had existed peacefully for generations found themselves caught between advancing armies. German commanders, working with incomplete information and disrupted communications, sought to organize local responses wherever possible. In some areas, available units were assembled to reinforce threatened positions. Elsewhere, officers attempted to reconnect isolated formations that had lost contact during the morning's confusion. These efforts varied considerably from one sector to another. The invasion front extended across a broad area, and each commander faced different circumstances. Some units remained relatively cohesive. Others had become scattered by the pace of events, damaged communications, or the fragmented nature of the terrain. The result was a battlefield where neighboring formations often had only a limited understanding of each other's situation. The hedgerow country contributed significantly to this fragmentation. Unlike open ground, where large formations could observe and coordinate over long distances, the bocage divided the landscape into countless small compartments. Each hedgerow concealed what lay beyond it. Each bend in the road limited visibility. Every orchard, farmyard, and drainage ditch introduced another obstacle. Military operations became increasingly decentralized. Small groups of soldiers frequently made decisions based on local conditions rather than a complete picture of the wider battlefield. Historians have often described the Normandy campaign as a series of interconnected small unit actions rather than one continuous battle. The terrain itself encouraged that outcome. Communication remained one of the greatest challenges. Telephone lines damaged during the opening stages of the invasion were difficult to restore under continuing artillery fire and frequent movement. Radio networks, while useful, were not always reliable across the varied landscape. As a result, many headquarters depended on dispatch riders and messengers to carry information between units. These methods worked, but they required time. And on June 6th, time was increasingly valuable. Reports that accurately described conditions in one village could be outdated by the time they reached a divisional headquarters several miles away. Commanders often found themselves making decisions based on information that reflected the battlefield as it had existed an hour earlier. Another factor increasingly shaped operations across Normandy: the sky. Throughout the day, Allied aircraft maintained a strong presence over the battlefield. Fighter aircraft conducted reconnaissance, observed road movement, and supported ground operations where opportunities arose. This had practical consequences for German planning. Daylight movement along exposed roads became significantly more difficult. Military vehicles frequently sought concealment beneath trees, beside stone buildings, or within wooded areas whenever possible. Long-distance movements often required careful timing and route selection. As a result, reinforcing threatened sectors became more complicated than simply issuing orders. The ability to move quickly had become an increasingly scarce resource. The cumulative effect of these challenges was significant. Instead of one clearly defined front line, Normandy became a patchwork of separate engagements. One village might remain relatively quiet while another only a few miles away experienced intense fighting. One road remained open, another became impassable. Some formations maintained regular communication with higher headquarters. Others operated for extended periods with only limited contact. The complexity of the battlefield made broad strategic coordination increasingly difficult. As evening approached on June 6th, it became clear that the character of the campaign had changed. The beaches had been the beginning. The struggle now extended into fields, villages, orchards, crossroads, and the dense hedgerows that covered much of the Norman countryside. For both sides, expectations formed before the invasion were giving way to the realities of the terrain. Every advance required careful movement. Every crossroads mattered. Every village could influence operations well beyond its size. The campaign in Normandy would not be decided in a single dramatic moment. It would unfold gradually, across countless individual actions, each contributing to the larger outcome. The largest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded in establishing a foothold. Now the challenge for both armies was no longer reaching France. It was fighting across it. As darkness returned to Normandy on June 6, 1944, the sounds of the invasion did not disappear. Artillery still echoed across the countryside. Ships remained offshore. Aircraft continued to pass overhead. The longest day was ending, but the battle was far from over. Across Normandy, headquarters worked through the night to assemble reports from units scattered across the front. The information arrived slowly. Telephone lines had been damaged in many areas. Roads remained congested. Messengers often needed hours to travel between command posts. Many reports described only a small part of a much larger picture. No commander yet possessed a complete understanding of the day's events. Throughout the afternoon and into the evening, German formations had fought under widely different conditions. Some coastal strongpoints continued to resist long after neighboring positions had fallen silent. Elsewhere, units had withdrawn or become isolated as communications broke down and the front shifted inland. The result was a battlefield that resisted simple description. Maps inside headquarters were updated repeatedly, yet each revision seemed to raise as many questions as it answered. Some areas remained firmly under German control. Others had changed hands. Several sectors could not be accurately assessed at all. The human cost of the day was becoming increasingly apparent. Both Allied and German forces had suffered substantial casualties during the landings and the fighting that followed. Medical stations worked continuously. Field hospitals filled with wounded soldiers. Many formations ended the day with significantly reduced strength after hours of sustained combat. At the same time, thousands of Allied troops, vehicles, and supplies had continued arriving across the beaches, steadily expanding the bridgeheads established that morning. Yet amid these developments, uncertainty persisted at the highest levels of command. For months before D-Day, Allied planners had conducted an extensive deception campaign designed to convince Germany that the principal invasion would occur in the Pas-de-Calais region. Dummy equipment, misleading radio traffic, double agents, and carefully managed intelligence all reinforced that expectation. Even after large-scale landings had begun in Normandy, some German leaders remained cautious about committing every available reserve. What if the events of June 6 represented only the opening phase? What if the decisive assault had yet to begin? This uncertainty shaped strategic decisions throughout the evening. Intelligence officers continued evaluating incoming reports. Senior commanders compared reconnaissance findings with earlier assessments. Despite the scale of the Normandy landings, many still believed that another, larger invasion might follow across the Strait of Dover. The Pas-de-Calais remained a central concern. Its shorter distance from Britain had long made it the most anticipated landing area in German planning. The possibility that Normandy served as a diversion could not be dismissed lightly. Adolf Hitler also continued to regard the situation through that lens. He remained convinced that the Normandy landings might not represent the main Allied effort. As a result, several important reserve formations were retained rather than immediately committed elsewhere. From the perspective of Allied planners, this was a significant success. One of the most elaborate military deception operations ever undertaken continued to influence German strategic thinking even after the invasion had begun. The campaign had achieved more than surprise. It had created lasting uncertainty. As midnight approached, the battlefield grew quieter in some places and more active in others. Engineers worked to improve the beachheads. Supply ships continued unloading equipment. Damaged roads were repaired. Commanders on both sides prepared for the battles that would begin again with first light. No one expected the fighting to end quickly. The events of June 6 had established the opening chapter of the Normandy campaign, not its conclusion. By the end of D-Day, the largest amphibious invasion in history had succeeded in securing footholds along the Normandy coast. For Germany, the carefully prepared Atlantic Wall had delayed the invasion in many sectors and imposed heavy costs. But it had not prevented Allied forces from establishing positions ashore. For the Allies, success on June 6 marked only the beginning of a much longer campaign across France. The fate of Normandy and, ultimately, Western Europe would be decided not in a single day, but over the weeks that followed. And as the night settled over the beaches once more, both sides understood that June 6th had changed the course of the war. The waiting was over. The battle for Normandy had begun. When people think about D-Day, they usually think about June 6th. The beaches, the landing craft, the airborne troops descending through the darkness. But by the time the sun set on that historic day, the invasion was only beginning. The campaign that followed would last for weeks. It would transform the quiet countryside of Normandy into one of the most contested battlefields of the Second World War. The struggle was no longer about reaching France. It was about remaining there. In the days after the landings, Allied engineers worked continuously to strengthen the beachheads. Temporary harbors were assembled offshore. Damaged roads were repaired. Fuel, ammunition, food, and medical supplies flowed across beaches that only days earlier had been battlefields. Every ship that crossed the English Channel carried more than soldiers. It carried the resources needed to sustain an army. The logistical effort became one of the defining achievements of the campaign. Without it, the landings could not have been maintained. Across Normandy, the fighting settled into a difficult rhythm. Instead of rapid advances across open terrain, operations often centered on individual villages, crossroads, and fields separated by dense hedgerows. The landscape itself slowed movement. Every ridge, orchard, and stone farmhouse could become an obstacle. Progress was measured not in dozens of miles, but sometimes in hundreds of yards. The campaign became one of endurance. As the weeks passed, the strain on German forces steadily increased. Industrial production inside Germany remained under pressure from strategic bombing. Transportation networks faced repeated disruption. Moving reinforcements and supplies became increasingly difficult. Fuel shortages complicated military planning. Equipment damaged in combat could not always be replaced quickly. Even formations that remained effective on paper often struggled with shortages of vehicles, ammunition, or experienced personnel. The challenge extended beyond the battlefield itself. Maintaining an army under constant pressure required an uninterrupted flow of resources. By the summer of 1944, that task was becoming increasingly difficult. The skies above Normandy also shaped the campaign. Allied aircraft supported ground operations, conducted reconnaissance, and targeted transportation routes throughout occupied France. Bridges, railways, and road junctions became frequent objectives. These operations complicated efforts to move large formations quickly between sectors. Military planning increasingly had to account for the practical difficulties of movement as much as the fighting itself. The campaign became as much about logistics as tactics. For many soldiers on both sides, the reality of Normandy differed sharply from expectations formed before the invasion. The campaign proved longer, more demanding, and more exhausting than many had anticipated. Long periods of waiting alternated with brief but intense engagements. Weather, terrain, and supply all influenced operations as much as battlefield decisions. Success often depended on persistence rather than dramatic breakthroughs. As July gave way to August, the strategic picture became increasingly clear. The Allied foothold established on June 6 had expanded steadily despite determined resistance. Additional troops continued arriving from across the English Channel. New equipment replaced damaged equipment. The bridgeheads merged into a continuous front. The invasion was no longer a precarious landing operation. It had become a sustained campaign. For many observers within the German command structure, the focus shifted from preventing an Allied foothold to responding to a changing strategic reality. The challenge was no longer stopping an invasion at the shoreline. It was confronting an opponent that had successfully established itself in Western Europe. Historians often describe the Normandy campaign as a turning point. Not because it ended the war immediately. It did not. Fighting would continue across France, the Low Countries, and Germany itself for many months. But June 6, 1944, marked the moment when the Western Allies returned to continental Europe in overwhelming force. From that point forward, the strategic balance in Western Europe had fundamentally changed. Today, visitors walking the beaches of Normandy encounter a very different landscape. The gunfire is gone. The bunkers remain. Some still overlook the sea, weathered by decades of wind and salt. Nearby, military cemeteries, memorials, and museums preserve the memory of those who fought and those who never returned. Together, they remind visitors that D-Day was not a single battle fought on a single morning. It was the beginning of a campaign whose consequences reached far beyond the beaches themselves. And for the people who witnessed those events, soldiers, civilians, and commanders alike, the morning of June 6th was not remembered simply because it was the largest amphibious invasion in history. It was remembered because it marked the beginning of the final chapter of the war in Western Europe. By late July 1944, nearly 7 weeks had passed since the Allied landings in Normandy. The initial beachheads had expanded, but progress inland had often been measured in small increments. The hedgerow country slowed movement, and both sides had committed significant resources to the campaign. Then, on July 25th, the character of the fighting changed. The Western Allies launched Operation Cobra, an offensive intended to break through the German defensive positions west of St. Lo. The operation began with a concentrated aerial bombardment against selected sections of the front. The attack was followed by a ground assault designed to exploit weaknesses created by the bombardment. Within days, the strategic situation shifted rapidly. Where previous advances had been gradual, Allied forces now began moving through gaps that had opened in the German defensive line. German commanders attempted to stabilize the front by committing available reserves where they could, but the pace of events made coordination increasingly difficult. Communications had been strained for weeks. Supply shortages affected fuel, ammunition, and replacement equipment. Continuous pressure along multiple sectors reduced the ability to establish a stable defensive line. As Allied forces advanced, German formations were increasingly forced to withdraw to avoid being isolated. The campaign entered a new phase. Instead of defending fixed positions in Normandy, many units now faced the challenge of conducting an organized retreat while under constant pressure. The consequences extended beyond individual battles. Large-scale withdrawals became necessary across much of the front, and the opportunity for coordinated counteroffensives diminished. One of the defining moments of this period followed in August, when Allied advances from different directions threatened to surround substantial German forces in what became known as the Falaise Pocket. As the encirclement tightened, thousands of soldiers and large quantities of military equipment became trapped. Some formations managed to withdraw through narrowing escape routes. Many others did not. The losses in personnel and equipment significantly reduced Germany's ability to maintain an effective defense in Normandy. By the end of August, the Normandy campaign had entered its final stage. The Allied breakout had transformed a difficult battle of attrition into a mobile campaign across France. The defensive line established before D-Day had collapsed, and the initiative in Western Europe had shifted decisively. The invasion that began on the beaches of Normandy on June 6th had become a sustained advance that would continue across France and toward Germany in the months ahead. History often remembers D-Day through a single image: landing craft racing toward the beaches, soldiers wading through the surf, the cliffs of Normandy rising through smoke. But for many of the German veterans who survived the campaign, their memories began much earlier. Not with gunfire, with waiting, months of it. They remembered endless hours inside concrete bunkers overlooking an empty sea. They remembered standing watch through rainstorms, convinced that every unusual sound might signal the invasion, and then discovering it was another false alarm. Day after day became week after week. The uncertainty became routine. Many later said that the waiting itself was exhausting. No one knew whether the invasion would come tomorrow or months later. Every sunrise carried the same unanswered question. When the invasion finally arrived, it did so on a scale that many veterans said they had never imagined possible. Several post-war interviews described the same moment: the fog lifting, the horizon clearing, and then, ships, not a fleet in the ordinary sense, an armada. One veteran recalled looking through binoculars and struggling to find open water between the vessels. Another said the sea seemed to have disappeared entirely beneath steel. Even soldiers who had expected an invasion admitted that its size defied everything they had imagined during years of preparation. The Atlantic Wall had been built to resist an invasion. Few had expected one of such magnitude. Another memory appears repeatedly in memoirs and interviews. The aircraft. Long before many defenders saw Allied soldiers, they heard them. The steady sound of engines grew into a continuous roar that lasted for hours. Transport aircraft, bombers, fighters, gliders. The sky itself seemed alive. For veterans who reflected on the campaign after the war, Allied air power became one of the defining features of Normandy. It influenced reconnaissance, movement, supply, communication, and planning. The battlefield extended far beyond the front line. The struggle for control of the air shaped almost every decision made on the ground. Many veterans also spoke about communication, or rather, the lack of it. The carefully prepared defensive network depended on information moving quickly between observation posts, artillery batteries, headquarters, and reserve formations. But on June 6th, that network came under extraordinary strain. Telephone lines were cut. Roads became difficult to use. Reports arrived late. Others never arrived at all. Individual commanders often understood only what was happening directly in front of them. The larger picture emerged slowly, if at all. Looking back years later, many described the experience not simply as confusing, but incomplete. They fought one battle, while another was unfolding only a few miles away. And then there was exhaustion. Not just physical exhaustion, mental exhaustion. The campaign that followed D-Day did not end in a single afternoon. It continued through the hedgerows, villages, and fields of Normandy for weeks. For soldiers on both sides, the demands of sustained combat, limited rest, and constant uncertainty left lasting impressions. Many veterans later recalled that time itself became difficult to measure. Days blended together. The campaign became a sequence of movements, reports, and decisions rather than clearly defined moments. For historians, D-Day represents more than one battle or one remarkable military operation. It marks a turning point in the Second World War. Not because the fighting ended that day. It did not. The campaign in Normandy continued through the summer of 1944, and the war in Europe would last nearly another year. But June 6th fundamentally changed the strategic landscape of Western Europe. By the evening of June 6th, the Atlantic Wall had not completely fallen. Thousands of German soldiers still held positions across Normandy. But something far more important had changed. For the first time since the war began, Germany faced a permanent Allied foothold in Western Europe. The battle for Normandy would rage for weeks, but D-Day marked the moment the strategic initiative shifted decisively. The road to Paris and eventually to Berlin had been opened. Today, nearly every bunker, memorial, cemetery, and quiet stretch of Normandy coastline serves as a reminder that history is rarely shaped by a single moment alone. It is shaped by countless individual decisions, months of preparation, hours of uncertainty, and ordinary people caught inside extraordinary events. The beaches are quiet now. The guns are silent. The scars have softened with time. But on the morning of June 6, 1944, the world changed, and nearly every chapter of modern European history that followed can trace part of its story back to that single day on the coast of Normandy.